increase our T regulatory cells and modulate our immune system and overall decrease inflammation. So fiber is really this catch-all term for a group of compounds that are quite structurally diverse that can be fermented by our microbiome. Now, we already mentioned, right, fiber can decrease the energy density of foods, lowers the glycemic index of foods, and helps people lose weight. It has inherent anti-inflammatory activities at the level of the gut interface and by helping the bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids. And it can also decrease colonization of these pathogenic bacteria in the gut. So now we're going to go into the microbiome in a lot more detail tomorrow, but there's more and more evidence that shows that the gut has a profound effect on how foods affect us. So for example, there was a recent study, this is just amazing to me actually. So the ketogenic diet, which we know has been used to inhibit seizures for a lot of years, actually may have its effect through the microbiome. So we know that seizures can be inhibited in a mouse model of epilepsy by putting these mice on a ketogenic diet. Now, if you take germ-free mice and you put them on a ketogenic diet, right, these mice have no microbiomes, the ketogenic diet does not work to inhibit seizures. And then if you take the microbiome of mice that were on a ketogenic diet and you transplant that into mice that are seizure prone without changing their diet, you're also transferring the anti-seizure effect. So, you know, it seems that the effect of the diet is really mediated completely through the microbiome. So this fermentation of fiber by our microbiome, as we said, results in short-chain fatty acids, which increase the IL-10 and the Treg cells. So with its anti-inflammatory effects, it makes sense, right, that fiber can also decrease autoimmune disease. And this was a study, again, that was done in a mouse model of autoimmune encephalomyelitis, which we use to mimic human MS. Now, these mice were bred to develop autoimmune diseases, so they're going to develop those autoimmune diseases. When you add non-fermentable dairy fiber, right, the stuff that's into their diets, these mice, it actually prevented them from developing autoimmunity. And that protective effect could actually be completely reversed as soon as you took the fiber out of their diet and put them back on a low fiber diet. So fiber alone in the diet could control whether these mice developed autoimmunity or not. So fiber really isn't the only nutrient that has its effects on the microbiome. There was this, fatty acids do too. So this is, we know that diets high in fat, especially in mice, are very inflammatory. But that when you add fish oil, it protects the mice that are fed this high fat diet. You know, it protects them from developing obesity and insulin resistance. Now, the effect of the fish oil is clearly mediated, at least in part, by the microbiome, because the mice that consume lard, right, the high fat diet, they develop diabetes and they don't do very well. But when they get a microbiome transplant from mice that have been fed fish oil, so you're not transferring the fish oil, just the microbiome that's been fed fish oil, they're now protected against obesity. So, you know, this fish oil acts on our metabolism by being a precursor for our cell membranes, but it also affects our microbiome. And the benefits are transferred through the microbiome. So to pound the point home one last time, we can think of our diet, and especially fiber in our diet, as analogous to small molecule drugs. But I would actually say they're even more powerful than small molecule drugs. So we can, you know, lots of resources in your IFM toolkit on how you can increase fiber, and like lots of different foods to eat, and the resources are there for you to use. Now, we keep talking about the Western diet being high in processed foods, right? Trans fats and carbohydrates, but processed foods also contain a lot of salt. And we know that salt in and of itself can be associated with developing autoimmune disease. And we also know that salt can affect the microbiome and create a more inflammatory microbiome. So, you know, the processed food is definitely all of the sugar and fat and flour, but it's also the salt. And this is another one that shows the importance of salt in really increasing that Th17 polarization. So we reviewed the effects of all the specific components of food, but what about kind of more complete dietary patterns, you know, the Mediterranean diet, the Paleo diet? Let's take a look at these. Well, clearly, first of all, we know that a Western diet, the SAD diet, is associated with a lot of inflammation. And I think evidence is pretty strong that the Mediterranean diet, it's been one of the ones that's most studied, has a really beneficial effect on inflammation and really lowers inflammation. So what is a Mediterranean diet? Well, a traditional Mediterranean kind of a dietary pattern that would be consistent with being called the Mediterranean diet has a high ratio of monounsaturated fat to saturated fat, lower saturated fat, has more omega-3s to omega-6s, has a lot of fruits and vegetables and legumes and whole grains. So we know that following a Mediterranean diet is anti-inflammatory, especially when you compare it to a typical Western or European diet. Now, this was a study that was done with 3,000 adults, and it showed the effect of the Mediterranean diet on a lot of different inflammatory biomarkers. We saw that the ones that were closest to meeting this traditional type of eating that was consistent with the Mediterranean diet really had lower CRP, lower IL-6, and a lot of other inflammatory markers, including homocysteine and fibrinogen levels. This was another study that looked at long-term vegetarians, and then they age and sex matched omnivores to compare them to. And they found that plasma vitamin C was higher and triglycerides, uric acid, CRP were lower in the long-term vegetarians. So the vegetarian, the high fruit and vegetable intake is really important. Okay, so let's just keep in mind Rachel's diet. I think it's starting to become pretty clear why she has a lot of inflammation promoting foods. So why don't you just type those again in the chat as we go through and see how many of you come up with after we talked about what's really inflammation producing in her diet. And why do you think that might have contributed to her developing lupus? So let's look at specific dietary changes and how they affect autoimmune diseases. We looked at inflammation, and we know that inflammation and autoimmunity are definitely tied. But autoimmune diseases, obviously, this is really important. They're the third leading cause of morbidity and mortality. And obviously, you guys are going to see a lot of them. And it's just been climbing higher and higher. And we know that autoimmune diseases, they're affected by various triggers. And we know one of those triggers is food. I'm sure as you heard Dr. Roundtree say, triggers of inflammation are infection, toxins, trauma, and food. So we have to look at what might be triggering it. So how does food trigger it? Well, it starts with having a genetic propensity that then in certain people, the food will trigger increased intestinal permeability, which, as we're going to see tomorrow, is a big underlying factor of why people get inflammation, because that food can now leak through the intestinal barrier and see all the immune cells on the other side. And that can really trigger the whole inflammatory response. So if certain proteins are the trigger, certain foods, the type of proteins that trigger the immune system, they're seen as danger and stranger. What if we took that trigger away? Well, that's the idea behind these elemental diets, right? That we take all those food triggers away. So elemental diets actually do reduce inflammation. They can have an effect on the enterocytes directly on the lining of the gut, and they can also have an effect on the microbiome. So, there's lots of different types of enteral nutrition and enteral diets, but typically they contain very simple formulas. So some of the real elemental ones, they just contain amino acids. They don't contain any peptides at all. The semi-elemental ones have certain peptides of varying lengths, and then the polymeric formulas, they have intact proteins and a little bit more complex carbs and the long-chain fatty acids. And then the specialized formulas, they have full proteins, but then other things like glutamine and other gut healing things are added to them. So the elemental diet actually worked really well in Crohn's disease. It actually worked efficacy similar to taking steroids. And this was another study where elemental diets were used in rheumatoid arthritis, again, showing an effect where it was similar to using a steroid. And it was interesting in this that the authors say that the concept of rheumatoid arthritis may be a reaction to a food antigen, and the disease process starts within the intestine. Now, this is not clearly a new concept of functional medicine doctors, but it really was quite a radical thing to say when this paper was published about 10 years ago. Now, elemental diets can, as we've seen, have a profound effect. But if you've ever tried an elemental diet, it's not a lot of fun. The food tastes bad. You know, people really want to eat. They don't want to just drink, and it's not really great socially. So at some point, people really need to eat real food. So if intact proteins are a problem and trigger intestinal permeability and inflammation, and enteral diets aren't palpable, what about exclusion diets, where you take out the proteins that tend to cause a lot of that inflammation? You know, in this particular one, 10 patients with rheumatoid arthritis underwent this 54-day calorie restriction. It's showing that the exclusion diets are not just because of losing weight again and calorie control. And if you guys look at the slides, I've hidden quite a number of them, but there's a whole bunch more slides that talk about exclusion diets and in slowly reintroducing the food. So how you reintroduce the foods after an exclusion diet is really quite important. And you'll see in the study, some were done by introducing, you know, vegetarian diet after, and they all have a different effect. So I think it's really going to be an individual thing that you have to work with your patients for. And look at, you know, taking out the foods that are going to be most likely to cause and trigger that autoimmune reaction, and then slowly putting them back in as you see is appropriate for your patient. So, you know, we talked about calorie restriction in the previous one. You know, calorie restriction alone is anti-inflammatory. So, you know, it's clearly tied to longevity. I think we've known that for a long time. And one of the ways it's tied to longevity is really by decreasing inflammation. And so this particular study, TNF alpha levels in the plasma and the adipose tissue were higher in people with without calorie restriction. And weight loss, again, didn't matter. It seemed to be the calorie restriction that was most important. So this brings us to the fasting mimicking diet. I think that it's a lot easier sometimes to do a fasting mimicking diet than it is to just stop eating. And, you know, fasting mimicking diet has shown to decrease CRP levels and have a lot of other beneficial metabolic effects. Also, time-restricted eating is another way to kind of get that fasting and that calorie restriction in. Time-restricted eating can be done anywhere from, you know, not eating or eating only within a specific time window, if you think of it that way, somewhere between 3 and 12 hours. And, you know, people do it quite differently. But when you restrict the time that you eat, it's been shown to decrease the inflammatory cytokines. And it also has an effect on your both peripheral clocks and actually your microbiome clock. Your microbiome has a clock as well. And this is another study that was done looking at time-restricted eating. And one of the things and I'll talk a little bit about this more tomorrow, but the microbiome needs times of food and it needs times of fasting so that you can help different microbes grow. Some grow more with lots of food and some grow when there's not food, and they sort of eat the mucus lining of the microbiome of your intestine. And so it's a really effective way is time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting. I always laugh when people say time-restricted feeding. That's usually referring to the mouse studies. But there's a lot of tools in your toolkit on how to do the intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating that I think are really good to look at with your autoimmune and inflammatory patients. And then there's the paleo diet. Now, this was quite popular. It's maybe getting less so and moving into the keto, but what is the paleo diet? And that's really our first question, right? Is the challenge is really identifying what exactly did our hunter-gatherers, you know, forefathers eat? It's not uniform. If you look across the world, it was quite different in different parts of the world, from eating a lot of fish to more meat. So there's not a lot of consistency. But if we tried to reconstruct our ancestors' diets, it seems that overall Paleolithic diets have kind of moderate to high protein and fat and moderate carbohydrate content of their diet. But the paleo diet is, as most people would agree, does eliminate certain types of food. Now, particularly lectins, those are the ones that are most, I think, talked about in the paleo world. So by eliminating dietary lectins, which adversely influence both enterocyte and lymphocyte structure and function, it's proposed that the peripheral antigen stimulus will be reduced and thereby result in a diminution of disease symptoms in people with RA. So again, the idea is a lot like the elemental diets. We're really taking out some of those inflammatory triggers. So what are lectins? Well, lectins are proteins that are found in plants and animals, and these proteins will bind sugars. We used to call them hemagglutinins. And when we eat them and they bind the glycoproteins and the sugars on our intestinal lining, that can cause damage to our gut lining and lead to leaky gut. Now, lectins are found in a lot of foods, most foods actually, but they're especially high in grains and wheat, dairy, legumes, and in nightshades. Now, one of the things to keep in mind that most traditional ways of cooking actually decrease and completely eliminate, in a lot of cases, the lectin content of foods. So that's something that's really important to remember. Soaking and cooking really decreases it. It seems like our ancestors kind of knew what they were doing. So, dietary lectins, there's really not a lot of evidence currently to back up the idea that everybody should be avoiding lectins. But it's reasonable to kind of consider taking them out of your patient's diet in an exclusion type of diet, just to see if they do have an effect, and that helps reduce the inflammation. And there is a lot of crossover actually between FODMAP foods and lectin-containing foods. So sometimes when people have a response, it may be something to do with SIBO, which we'll get into a little bit more tomorrow. So here's the updated paleo hypothesis, right? Is it really avoiding grains that contain anti-nutrients like lectins? So, wheat contains gluten. And that's the idea that a lot of people use and the reason they eat the paleo style diet. But again, that is not the case for every single person. Not everybody does have a bad response to lectin. So it's really important to really determine what your patient what kind of response they have. So grains are out in the paleo world, but one question is is there a difference between whole grains and refined grains, right? Now, this has been debated for a long time. In this particular study, they took 1,000 patients or participants that did not have type 2 diabetes. And they saw that whole grain consumption was inversely correlated to both PI1 and CRP, but refined grain was positively related to the PI1. And perhaps some of the conflicting results, because it is a little bit conflicting when you look at all of the studies that are out there. And I encourage you to look at some of the slides that are in this deck that I've hidden, and we're not going over just due to time, but there's a lot more studies in there for you to look at. But one of the reasons we may have some conflicting results from some of these studies is really because we're genetically different. There's a polymorphism in this TCF7L2 gene that actually has an effect on the risk of diabetes from whole grains based on the type of sequence they have at that particular SNP. Now, this is one, I know a lot of people get pretty intent on what type of diet they want to follow, and that one is always better than the other. And I really want to encourage you that it's not always just one type and that everybody's individual. In this case, they actually looked at the Mediterranean diet and the paleo diet to see how it was associated with inflammation and oxidative stress, and actually both of the diets worked. So, it matters people's genes, it matters what their microbiomes are too. Now, one thing to keep in mind with the paleo diet, a lot of people do paleo by eating a lot of meat. Now, the heme iron in red meat has been associated with oxidative damage and oxidative stress. And it may be why many of the epidemiological studies link red meat consumption with increased mortality. You know, there's a study published in the BMJ that followed 500,000 seniors, AARP members, and they showed an increased risk of all-cause mortality and death associated with both processed and unprocessed meat consumption. So it was attributed to the heme and the nitrates in meat. White meat, though, didn't increase risk. So they decreased when red meat was substituted for white meat. So just something to keep in mind. And clearly there's a lot of nuance to this because, you know, meal timing, cooking methods, storage methods, fat content of meat, you know, whether it's grass-fed or grain-fed, all of that obviously plays a big role. So again, this idea is nothing's all good, nothing's all bad. Really look at what is important for your patient and optimize that and put it into context. So that brings us to nightshades too, right? Nightshades have also been vilified in the autoimmune world, and there's a lot of strong opinions about them. But there unfortunately is very little evidence in the literature to support this idea that nightshades cause all inflammation. Now, there was one study that showed, you know, if you excluded them, it was helpful in antihistamine resistant scars that were itchy. It might be because nightshades contain these alkaloids, which may be a culprit. And, you know, nightshades also contain lectins, so that might be one of the reasons. So, you know, obviously if nightshades are eaten raw, that will have a different effect than if you cook them. You know, if you think of the traditional way we made tomato sauce, you know, they would boil it, they would remove the skins and the seeds, and those are the areas that have a lot of lectins. So, you know, again, it really is a bit nuanced. So the idea that nightshades are problematic in autoimmune disease also may be from food sensitivities. So the best way to determine this is through an elimination diet. Take them out for a while. See if they're a problem for your patient. And Dr. Fitzgerald's going to talk more about the elimination diet later. And then there's the ketogenic diet. You know, short-term ketogenic diet, I think there's no argument that it has a positive effect on weight loss and often on inflammation, but there's not a lot of evidence on the long-term impact of the ketogenic diet. You know, there's not been many studies that have gone more than 5 months of ketogenic diet. But some evidence shows that, you know, when they do long-term keto, it may have a higher increase in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and increasing insulin resistance. So a lot of people are using keto to help with diabetes. That's something to keep in mind. We don't know what the long-term consequences are. So we do need more research on that. If you think about ketogenic diet, you know, the average carb is about 5 to 10%. And when you have that low carbs, remember we talked about the fiber being so important for feeding the microbiome. You know, it's important when you do a ketogenic diet to really think about how you're doing it as well. Are you getting enough of those really important fruits and vegetables and all of the antioxidants that we talked about? You know, and are you getting enough fiber to feed your microbiome? So it's not that it can't be done well, but really think about the details. So let's get back to Rachel and let's look at what type of diet you're going to prescribe for her. You know, remember that's her diet diary. So, you know, in the chat, take a little bit, you know, go and say, what's one thing you can do? Let's just start with one thing and why you would do that. Right? Remember that she's a busy lady. She may not have time to do everything. Maybe she just eats one less food a week, add one vegetable, add one fruit, maybe drink one less soft drink. So just kind of write that in there and let's see what we come up with. You know, sometimes it's as simple as just adding in a couple cups of green tea a day rather than drinking something else. And that's a great way for people to start. You know, I can't drink alcohol on my low carb diet. I'll just have a couple of shots of gravy with a twist of bacon. So, you know, remember when you start making recommendations, patients are often going to try to find those loopholes. And so if you can make it easy for them, that's really important. So let's look at some of these dietary approaches and some of the resources that you have. So we've looked at Rachel's diet. You know, can we add some spices to her diet that might be anti-inflammatory? Hopefully you're still coming up with some really good ideas for that. And I just want to iterate, food matters, right? Nearly all degenerative diseases have underlying pro-inflammatory state as an etiology, and food affects that pro-inflammatory state. So these are some of the summary for you. So you can go back and look, remember, reduce arachidonic acid, increase omega-3s, make a higher ratio of those omega-3s to omega-6s than they're currently eating, make sure they get all the cofactors for those fatty acid desaturase enzymes, you know, increase antioxidants, phytonutrients, get those deep pigmented fruits and vegetables. It's very important. Decrease that glycemic load, you know, get rid of those trans fatty acids, optimize their blood glucose regulation with the lower glycemic load, get rid of some of the foods that are triggering things, those antigenic foods. And we're going to talk about how to do that in a sec, and make sure you get lots and lots of fiber for them. If they can't get it from their food, sometimes adding a fiber supplement can help as well. You know, and the evidence suggests that, you know, a diet incorporating these principles that we've just gone over will really help with inflammation and with autoimmunity. So the diet, we talked about the glycemic load, fiber, fatty acids, and these are here for you to refer back to. So that first step, so now if Rachel was ready to, like, I'm going all in, you tell me what to do, I'm going to do it all. You know, so there's a number of ways to start. We can start with those small changes that we just talked about, or we can say, okay, here you go, Rachel. If she had support, she wanted to do it. One of the best ways to start for someone with autoimmune disease is this comprehensive elimination diet. And it's in the toolkit. All of the resources are there for you. But a comprehensive elimination diet really reduces those food triggers that we looked at. It kind of mimics a little bit that elemental diet, maybe not to that extent, but getting rid of a lot of that allergenic load, which will help restore your gut or your patient's gut. And it has all of these features. And one of the features, though, is that there's no calorie restriction. So they don't have to be hungry when they eat an elimination diet, but they do want to remove any of those food triggers. So, you know, you take out the dairy and the gluten, add lots of the phytonutrients. It's a really great way to start. And I encourage you to go into your toolkit, take a look. There's food lists that you can hand to your patients, and they can check off what kind of foods they want. And it's all there for you. And another type of diet that you can look at, you know, elimination diet is a really good one. It's one I actually start with if my patients are ready to do. But there's other ones too in this advanced therapeutic interventions. And one of them is the Renew food plan, as you can see here. Now, I think you're going to get the ability after this module to get onto Facebook and to together go through a Renew diet. There's no better way than experiencing it yourself. That helps you answer all of the questions that your patients are going to ask. It's really important to try it a little bit, at least once. See how you feel. I think that's important. But the Renew diet is really set up to be a whole system reboot, right? To really address autoimmune, weight, mitochondrial function, neurological conditions, really do a whole reset. All right, and here's some of the features of the Renew food plan. And you can see the idea is to help reduce some of those sugar cravings and also identify, get those trigger foods out as well. So it again is gluten and dairy free. And again, all of the resources that you need are in your toolkit. There's a menu planner, a shopping guide, there's recipes. And I really encourage you to do the Renew food plan with everybody after this module. I think it's fun to experience. You're going to learn a lot that you'll be able to help with your patients. So it does take out dairy and some legumes as well, and some of the starchy vegetables. So really try to decrease some of that insulin resistant foods potentially. And again, all of the food lists are in your toolkit. There's lots of references that, if your patients are wondering, give me, is there any evidence behind this? There's lots of it. So after this module, there's going to be Facebook groups that are set up and some webinars, and they're going to go through how to do it in a lot more detail. So I really encourage you to do that. So we did talk a lot about diet, but don't forget the bottom of the matrix where there's all of these other lifestyle factors. We looked at the stress that Rachel had. We looked at her sleep. Those are all issues. And now Dr. Salt is going to dive into these a little deeper in day 2 to 3. I just want to mention them. Diet's important, but don't forget some of the other things. What fits your busy schedule better, exercising an hour a day or being dead 24 hours a day? So I want to end here with the state that nutrition research is going. I mentioned earlier the importance of recognizing your patient's uniqueness, right? That one size fits all just doesn't really work. And even though there are certain principles for anti-inflammatory diet, that you may have to modify and tweak that depending on your patient. So for example, we know that in this particular study, they showed that people eating identical meals can have very different glycemic responses to that meal. And they did this study by looking at all the microbiome, blood test questionnaires, and they were able to run that through a machine learning algorithm to design a diet for that particular individual that reduced their blood glucose. So you really keep in mind the importance of people's individuality, and that's of course determined by their genetics and by their microbiome, and then of course their environment, which results in their epigenetics. So microbiome, clearly an important part of making a person the individual that they are. And as we saw, the individual response to a lot of different foods are really mediated by the microbiome. And then the nutrigenetics and nutrigenomics. So nutrigenetics, there's a lot of people that have SNPs in different, you can see some of them here, different SNPs in those desaturase enzymes, different SNPs in their ability to absorb nutrients and antioxidants. And so it's really important to keep that in mind too. Now, this is another way genetics is involved in modifying diet. Right? The focus group was vehemently opposed to genetically altered corn and wheat, but they loved the chocolate flavored lettuce. So I just want to leave you with, the Hippocrates who said, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. And really, it's the first place you're going to start with every patient clearly with autoimmune disease and inflammation, and pretty much every patient in general. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Helen. That was a wonderful presentation. So as we did in the morning, we're going to query you on a few questions that we get around this presentation and some case studies that you'll help us explicate. So first, as we have been doing, let's go to a polling question. And that question is, you obviously heard Dr. Messier talk about Rachel. So what is one dietary recommendation you would suggest in the case of Rachel that Helen just presented? And again, use one word, or I say eliminate processed foods. I like that. That's very
That's more than
creative.
one word, but
it's more than one word.
Yeah.
You can hyphenate, if you put 15 words together, you could do that.
There's good, yeah. I was watching in the chat too. You guys did an amazing job of picking them out. Soda, there's a big one. I'm assuming eliminate soda.
Eliminate soda.
Benefit of the doubt. And fiber, yes, clearly, I like that one.
Yeah, you made some great comments about fiber, Helen, and how important it is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really comes down to the microbiome. Oh, this is great. So some specific ones: flax, get rid of gluten, add vegetable, broccoli, cabbage. This is great. No sugar.
Yep.
Phenols, rainbow, nice. Lots of.
And then you touched on intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating, and so did Bob, and so I think it's good that people are talking about that.
Yeah, this is great.
Vegetables.
You guys got it. Vegetables. That's the big one. Elimination, fiber, vegetables. Yes.
All right. So let's go to a question for you, Helen. what are the dietary recommendations you would suggest in this case you just presented? Maybe 2 or 3 dietary recommendations that you would suggest right off the bat.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, I mean, starts with assessing where, in this case, Rachel, really where your patient is at. You know, clearly Rachel is busy, she's got children, she's got a job, she's tired. Asking her to do a lot of dietary changes all at once, even though she might get the best, biggest bang for the buck, starting an elimination diet, doing all of that right away. If you don't assess where your patient's at, if you don't understand what they're willing to do, then they're just going to leave and they're not going to come back. So that's the very first thing, is really understand that if she's willing to, you can make a case saying, look, you really feel tired, changing your diet completely, getting rid of those antigens, getting rid of the dairy, the gluten, doing a more full elimination diet is going to make you feel better right away. She may want to do that. She may be engaged. If you do that, you definitely need to help them prepare ahead of time. You don't want them to fail. So, they don't have to start it as soon as they leave your office. Give them time. Let them buy the foods. Let them look up recipes. Let them prepare for that. And then you can support them through that. Now, in her case, she wasn't willing to do that big elimination diet right up front. So start with small things. And I saw you guys mention that in the chat already. Just replace 1 Pepsi a day with a cup of green tea, right? Maybe that's a good start. The green tea has the theanine. It might help her relax a little bit. It's got the anti-inflammatory effect. That's really going to help a lot. Maybe just work at trying to find some substitutes for the gluten that she eats all the time, right? Just even a little thing like, maybe just increase the amount of time between when you eat at night and when you eat in the morning. So that time restricted eating window, just increase it. Start at 8 hours and go to 9 to 10. Give her something that's easy to do, to work on. Add some spices to her food, work at maybe cutting up some vegetables, some carrot sticks, and taking those to work as a snack. She needs to snack on things, to start adding some of those vegetables in, and then work on the stress and the sleep components too, because that's also going to help her make those dietary changes. So, and I know there was a lot of other really good comments as we went through that people had in terms of oatmeal and blueberries and other things that you can add, just make it, and someone like Rachel, she needs help, right? She thinks that corn is a vegetable. She thinks that she thinks she's taking the multivitamins, so she doesn't have any nutrient deficiencies. So it starts with education. She has to be engaged. Just telling her to change her diet without really putting that education around it and helping her understand why isn't going to help. So those are just some of my thoughts around that.
Those are great. You started with Readiness to Change. We have a toolkit item on that, so I would just recommend that people look at that. That's obviously you started with that. That's incredibly important. Using nutritionists or health coaches, you also kind of inferred that using education is really important. And the last thing I'll just add to that, Helen, is just adding on to what you said of looking at intestinal permeability, which you talked about and you'll talk about on Sunday as well, as it's a dimmer. It's not an on-off switch. So all of these things that you're doing can improve intestinal permeability. It's not just one thing, at least in my experience.
That's very true. It's a continuum. And especially one of the other things, I completely agree with the intestinal permeability. We know that being overweight and insulin resistance is a big driver of inflammation. And so one of the tricks I do with my patients is just when they're feeling hungry and they feel like snacking, just get them to drink a glass of water first. A lot of times they think they're hungry when they're really thirsty. So, and what I like to do is have them put a little scoop of fiber supplement in that water. And so that gets that satiation as well. They feel a little bit more full and they don't eat because they're not hungry anymore.
That's a great clinical pearl. Like we're going to go to another poll here. What dietary components can modulate and or lower NF-kappa B if more than one word, please hyphenate. Use a lot of hyphens. So we've talked now, Dr. Roundtree and Dr. Messier talked about NF-kappa B. I think we're all familiar. And now we're getting into the therapeutics, omega-3s. I'm glad people said that, given the fact that Dr. Fitzgerald talked about that quite a bit. Dr. Messier was drinking apparently some green tea.
And I have it again, actually. I always have my green tea that I sip through the day. It's great. I see ficitin, which is a flavonoid in the same family as quercetin. That one's really big in the anti-aging world, but this is great. Spices, absolutely. There's that reason for this seasonings. Did someone say N-acetylcysteine in there? Yeah, I think so.
A lot of people are clearly saying quercetin, so that's great. Quercetin, curcumin, you're going to talk about those tomorrow. What's the one that comes from
pomegranates? What's the one that actually gets made by the microbiome into the anti-inflammatory compound?
You've from pomegranate, you've
stumped me. There's a compound in pomegranates that gets converted by the microbiome into urolithin A, which is very anti-inflammatory. Let's see if someone puts that up.
Excellent. All right, so let's go to a case here.
Acid. There we go. Perfect.
So here's a 55-year-old man newly diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis and wants to avoid DMARDs, which have been recommended by his rheumatologist. You assess his 3-day diary and note he consumes a typical standard American diet, SAD diet. So Helen, where would you start?
Yeah. So this one, I mean, it's very similar, I think, to with Rachel. Start with that readiness to change. Start with the education. Often I do this. I often do labs to begin with. Looking at how bad things are, CRP level, vitamin D level. Just getting an overall picture of where he's at, what his nutrient deficiencies are. And then again, if he's ready to change, when we're looking at a newly diagnosed rheumatoid arthritis or any kind of autoimmune disease, really that elimination diet, if they're willing to do it, is an amazing way to start. It takes away those antigenic foods, the food drivers of the inflammatory response. And it's really important because they're different for everyone. Dr. Fitzgerald, I think, is going to talk a little bit about food sensitivities and testing for those, but really, and you can use that, and those are really good, but the gold standard is still looking at taking them out of the diet, seeing how people respond, putting them back in and testing that response, and that's the elimination diet. So definitely, if they're willing to do it, that's a really great one to start with. If not, I usually try to get the gluten and the dairy out at a minimum, just to start with.
I think you answered that second question.
I think so. Yeah. That's
great.
And a lot of really what would apply to Rachel definitely applies in this case.
So let's go to one final poll for this little session. This is a question in which there is a best correct answer. There are some good answers, but what's the best correct answer? Which of the following is a dietary choice that would likely result in the most increased inflammation? High-fat foods, high GI foods, glycemic index foods, fast food meals, farm-raised salmon.
Nobody's choosing the farm-raised salmon. That's good. Yeah, the high fat. It's interesting that when you look at all the most literature, they always talk about a high fat diet is used to induce diabetes and insulin resistance. Clearly that's in the most model, but interesting.
Yeah, in this question is interesting. People are answering fast food meals, which is undefined. What do we mean by fast food meals?
Could be a salad, could be a Big Mac, could
be. Right.
Exactly.
That's right. So, I mean, what I would answer as the most increased inflammation, high fat foods, we don't know if that's, as Dr. Fitzgerald talked about, what kind of fat. So we do know that a high glycemic index foods, we know what that means. That's pretty well defined. That to me would be would result in the most increased inflammation from the presentation that you just gave.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. And other than that lovely breakfast sandwich that no one really likes.
Yeah. So you talked a bit about glycans. What is the dietary impact of inflammation on glycans?
Yeah, and glycans, I'm going to do a talk on this coming up later for IFM, but glycans is a really broad term, meaning glycan is a long chain of monosaccharides or sugar molecules. Now, the glycans in the context that I talked about in this dietary talk are the glycans that can get attached to proteins and lipids, causing these advanced glycation end products. Now, that's a non-enzymatic attachment. It happens through this Amadori type of reaction. But there's also, we use glycans in our body for just about everything. So we have glycosyltransferase enzymes, and we attach glycans to the outside of our cell membranes. We find them there. We find them in the extracellular matrix. We find them inside, and they're branched. There's long, complex kind of molecules that really we're learning more and more about. SARS-CoV-2 because glycans cover the spike protein and cover the virus too. So from a dietary perspective, obviously the high sugar will cause the ages, and that's really important to lower that glycemic index. That's a really important dietary intervention we can make. But we also know that high sugar can damage what we call the endothelial glycocalyx. So that's the glycan covering of our vascular endothelium. So the endothelium, as you know, is that single cell lining of all of our blood vessels. And on the inside of that single cell lining is a very complex glycan structure made of proteoglycans, glycosaminoglycans. And one of the things, and that actually really determines the health of our blood vessel. So high sugar damages that. And so that's another reason why glycemic load is so important, and it's so important to really lower that in overall immune system and vascular health. And we know that certain foods that we eat contain these glycans, and those are the building blocks for the good glycans. So things like sulfated polysaccharides you see in seaweed, those can be precursors for these good glycans. So we can go in a whole nother talk about that later.
A whole nother talk. You gave us a short synopsis of that. That's wonderful. So the last thing, is there any other, you certainly ended your talk with clinical pearls. Any other takeaways from your talk that you want to leave us with in a minute or two?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, really remember that food can be both inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. And because we all eat, it's really the fundamental starting place that you're going to start when you deal with any patient with inflammation or autoimmune diseases. And of course, remember, inflammation underlies pretty much all chronic diseases. So remember that food is your starting place, and food acts synergistically on a multitude of different pathways. And so you don't get that on-off that you get with pharmaceuticals. You get beautiful modulation that comes with food. And it's really about increasing the phytonutrients, the fiber, lowering the glycemic load, really just bring up those anti-inflammatory foods and lower the pro-inflammatory foods. And you really can't go wrong. And then in the context of everybody's an individual. So certain foods, one individual may react to. So always keep your patient first, keep the fundamental principles. And if your patient doesn't respond how you think they should, you're going to have to reassess that in light of your patient.
That's great. So I want to go to a break, but I do want to remind people or have them look at their schedule. We have tomorrow and the next day Zoom breakouts with all of our educators independently. So while we're not together, we do want to connect in various ways. And one is to dialogue and ask questions specifically. So we're doing that, of course, as a group. Later today, we'll do a Q&A with all of you with questions that you've submitted in the question app. And we're also doing this specifically. So tomorrow,